I'm putting the final touches on my vampire survivors-like game called Sewer Swarm. Over the last few weeks, I've been polishing the game, adding new features, fixing bugs, and responding to feedback. Today I wanted to share the latest updates and improvements. One of the biggest changes is a major rework to the warrior, magician, and archer classes. The rogue was already in a good spot, so I kept its core gameplay intact, but I did make some minor tweaks to the visuals and things like that. My goal with the update was to give each class a stronger identity and make sure their abilities felt more cohesive and fun. So starting off with the warrior class, the warrior is all about getting in close range and dealing damage with big attacks. The warrior has some of the lowest cooldowns in the game, and it allows them to use their attacks more often. But the trade-off is that, compared to ranged, it's not as strong as ranged attacks because most of their attacks are melee. So the first row of warrior abilities focuses on heavy cleaves and spinning attacks. The second row of abilities features like pierces and stabs and slashes, like that sort of thing. And then the third row uses throwing axes, and it's kind of like a hybrid of melee and ranged. So the next class I worked on was the magician. The magician has some of the largest attacks in the game, but those attacks are typically close to mid-range. The first row of abilities are small and fast projectiles at a really long range. The second row of abilities are mid-size attacks and mid-range. And then the third row are large attacks that are basically close range and almost kind of melee. So it was an interesting idea to try to make a melee class for a magician. So I ended up going with this fist idea. I got the idea from Wizard of Legend, and I don't know, I think it came out kind of fun. Could be better, but it's okay. So once I finished the warrior and the magician, I moved on to the archer. The archer is all about precision, fast attacks at a really long range. And compared to the other classes, the archer's abilities feel more impactful, but they have like a longer cooldown associated with them. So for the archer abilities, the first row was more of like rapid fire attacks, like a lot of basic attacks, a lot of auto attacks. The second row is more of like a burst spread, like covering multiple angles and kind of attacking multiple enemies at once. And then the third row, I wanted to try to do something a little more interesting. So I kind of had the idea of like a hawk companion or like hawk related attacks where they can protect you and things like that. It's pretty interesting, and I think it came out pretty fun. And lastly, the rogue class. Basically, the rogue is a very versatile class. So depending on what abilities you choose, you can have really good mobility, you can have really good range, or multiple sources of damage. So for the first row of abilities, it pretty much revolves around your shadow clones, and the clones will mimic your attacks. The second row is basically all about mobility and speed and dealing damage that way. And the third row is all about keeping your distance and dealing damage with throwing stars and ranged attacks. One of the next changes that I wanted to make was the enemies. I felt like at points they were a little too stale, a little predictable. So I added a little bit more variety, and I got rid of the snakes. They looked a little goofy, so I just wanted to get rid of them. So we have the rat, which is a basic enemy that just chases the player. We have the fly, which usually there's a group of them, and they all spawn in a line, and they just chase the player. Then I added the bomber rats. So this is one of the new enemies that basically just a rat, but it explodes when it dies. So it adds actually a fair bit of, complexity to the gameplay. So I made sure not to put too many of them, but over time, the game just kind of gets crazy over time. So there will be a lot of them eventually. And then the bomber flies. So they will spawn in a cluster. They'll spawn on like one side of the map and they just head in a straight line. And so if you just happen to cross paths with one of these bomber fly clusters, they do explode on death, and it can can make it pretty crazy. One of my main goals was improving the game's difficulty curve. Before, the pacing felt a little too abrupt. Now the game starts off pretty slow without being boring and gradually ramps up from there in a pretty consistent way. So casual players, I would expect maybe a few minutes to last in the game, and then more advanced players can push 10 minutes and beyond that point for a real challenge. And also, to help with the balance, I tweaked the event timing, like the spawn of the events. I added a pity system so that you can get bonus heal gems based off of like your HP and a few other factors. Adding the changes to the enemies also completely changed the dynamic of the game and changed the balance of the game. Overall, I'm pretty happy with the balance changes. I know it's not perfect, but I believe it's in a much better state now than it was a few weeks ago. So one of the next things I worked on was feedback and bug fixes. So I updated the leaderboards so that you can see the abilities that you used in your last run, and you can see what abilities other people used. I added a buff UI so you can easily see when your buffs are active. I updated the menus, for easier navigation. The last abilities that you picked are now saved, so the game will remember you and pull up the abilities that you last used. I improved the controller navigation. I updated the skill bar UI so you can more clearly see when your abilities are on cooldown. And this has been in the game for some time, but it is worth mentioning that you can track the duration of your spell, so you can kind of see how long that particular spell will last for. I fixed a bug with CDR. Basically, CDR was only working like half of the time. It was a pretty big bug, and like your cooldown would jump. Let's say you only had 10 seconds left of your cooldown, and then your CDR buff wore off, it would jump back up to like 20 seconds or something. So that is no longer happening. So that's kind of like a huge buff all around. CDR actually works. There was a double time bug that I fixed. Basically, if you paused the game and then you went to the how to play menu, it would like double your game speed. So that's been fixed. And then I also fixed the UI arrow bug. Basically, there's like little arrows that show up in the game when to point you in the right direction of the events or where to go. And if you would fail an event, they wouldn't properly reset. So that covers the list of changes, bug fixes, and feedback that I've received so far. There's probably a lot more things that I didn't mention, but overall, I'm very, very happy with where the game is today. When I started Sewer Swarm, I thought it was going to be a quick project, something small that would reinforce what I've learned over the years. But as I kept going, as I kept developing, I started to really like the project a lot. I would consistently just like playtest over and over for fun. So I really wanted to refine it and polish it and make it something I could be proud of. Now that it's in a pretty good place, I'm excited to like finally move on to other projects. If you'd like to try Sewer Swarm or any of the other games that I've made, they're all free to play in your browser on my itch page. Thanks so much for listening, and have a nice day.